This is Street Knowledge with Chris Graham.
Welcome to the podcast. Chris Graham and Scott German joining me here today. And we're going to talk about, we're going to get away from the topic of the issues of the day in sports, UVA sports, Orioles, Nationals, whatever the case may be. And we're going to talk about a guy that both of us owe our sports writing careers to. Jim Gordon, longtime sports editor at the News Virginian, Waynesboro, Virginia. Gave us both our starts in the sports journalism business. He passed away last week, age of 78, and it's tough. I wrote a column this past weekend about Jim, sharing some of my fondest memories, and there's so many of them, and I've actually gotten some text and some other communications from other alumni, Jim alumni. I'll kind of share some of those too as we go through. But Scott and I both cut our teeth in journalism. In that office, that musty office that Jim Gordon had back in the corner of the News Virginian. And Scott, it's a passing of an icon and a passing of an era too. Jim was an old school sports editor. I mean, he literally was old school. He was a guy that was still in the paced up era of the newspaper business, which, if you're a kid listening to this podcast, paced up. But yeah, Jim was cut from the old teeth of sports writers, and it's definitely sad to see him go.
Yeah, I when I heard the news last week, and I hadn't seen Jim in about a year, just feel bad about not keeping in touch with him any better than I did. But I had seen him fairly regularly up until about a year ago, and I found out that he moved out of the area down to Richmond to the VA hospital last couple of months of his life. But Jim, Jim was a very unique, a very kind-hearted individual that is the kind of guy that leaves a lasting impression on you. And I felt. When I heard the news, it was almost like losing a father, as well as a best friend, a colleague, whatever, all wrapped into one. And life goes on, and sports world goes on. But I tell you, the sports world around our little part of it, Shenandoah Valley, certainly is going to be there's going to be a void here for a while. It only wasn't. I think you mentioned one of your columns. You probably had a byline in 10 years, but still to know that you might meet Jim on the street, you might run into him, at a ball game or whatever, and there was someone there that could look you eye to eye, talk sports with you, and knew what he was talking about. And we've lost that little bit of history here in the valley.
I wrote this in the column I wrote, and I thought it's worth telling. Maybe the telling would even be more dramatic than the writing. But when I first got my first job at the News Virginia, which was my first journalism job out of college, I had just dropped out of law school. I was kind of trying to figure out what to do. I'd been accepted into the MFA Creative Writing program at UVA, but that was not going to start for almost a year. It was like middle to late fall when I got accepted, but the admission was for the next year. So had time to kill. I was substitute teaching to make, extra bucks and trying to live cheap otherwise. Saw an ad in the paper, part-time sports writers needed. And I thought, well, I like sports. I can write. Maybe I'll do this, until I go back to grad school. And so I had just happened to read an article. I think it was in Sports Illustrated. It certainly wasn't online, 1995. This is when I'm applying for this job. And I read an article about how ESPN execs would conduct job interviews with people who wanted to be on SportsCenter, and how they would throw questions out of left field about obscure sports or players from, the bench players from the 1970s. I mean, just weird. They would just try to throw curveballs at the anchors to test the breadth of their sports knowledge. So I read that article. I'm thinking, man, that's how they do it in the big leagues. So of course, I sit down in Jim's office, get an interview with him, and he starts going on about this this middle school swimmer. Her name was Melanie Matthews. Actually, I didn't write this in the column, but she was a a cousin of Dave Matthews, the now obviously now famous singer, and she was a top youth swimmer. And he's just, for 15 minutes, he's extolling the virtues of Melanie Matthews and how she was this great, and she was also a great cross-country runner, and I'm just going on and on. And I'm like, man, this guy's a genius. He expects me to know middle school swimming. This guy's, I learned many years later, of course, after time, that was just Jim Gordon. He got on a tangent, and he just went with it. But also, what I thought that story tells, Scott, is that, he had the ability. I wrote this. He wrote about Ralph Sampson when Ralph was at Harrisonburg High School. He wrote about Del Curry when Del Curry was at Fort Defiance High School. Reggie Harris, who pitched in the World Series, was at Waynesboro High School. He wrote about him then. Kevin Madden, who maybe was the best basketball player of all of them, who didn't get to play in the pros because he hurt his knee at UNC. All these guys he wrote about when they were high school players, and he got to write about them in college too. But the sports beat. The local sports beat. It was more important to him to go to a JV volleyball game than it was to go to an ACC tournament. That's how much he loved his job. That's how much he loved sports. That he could talk about a middle school swimmer for 15 minutes and not bat an eye. That was what made, to me, that's what really just made Jim Gordon tick, was just that's how much he loved what he did.
Yeah, right, exactly. He could talk with passion about middle school swimming one night, and then the next night be in a press conference asking some pretty direct questions to Dean Smith or Terry Holland. Jim wasn't afraid. And often I went to games with Jim, and Jim would be one of the first of the media always to raise his hand and ask a question. And I think a lot of people in the room were kind of holding their breath as to just because Jim wasn't afraid to ask tough questions. And coming from a little small daily newspaper in Waynesboro, Virginia, which at the time, when during the Ralph era, we were the closest daily to Charlottesville outside of the Daily Progress. So, we gave UVA very extensive coverage, followed them on the road a lot, followed them in the NCAA tournament, I went to 2 Final Fours with him. Jim wasn't afraid to ask those questions, and the SID at the time happened to be kind of have some Waynesboro background, Rich Murray, and Rich respected Jim tremendously. Rich told me a number of times that he often wondered why Jim wasn't, moving up the ladder in the sports journalist business. But we later found out that Jim valued his family. He valued living in Waynesboro. He liked what he was doing, and being the sports editor of the News Virginian was all Jim Gordon needed. That's all he needed, and he never got rich doing it, but maybe not monetarily anyway. But if you could have seen the outpouring of support, and friends and family that was at Jim's funeral and at their family night, you know what? You got to kind of tip your hat and say, hey, if I could go out that way, that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, I didn't get an exact date on when he started at the News Virginia. Late 60s is about as best I can approximate it. And I remember sitting in that office because he had an office. He was separated from the rest of the newsroom at the News Virginia. Well, yeah, I was going to say for good reason. I think it was a mutual good reason. The newsroom folks couldn't stand him and his I wouldn't say antics. Jim was not an overbearing person at all, to say the least. But he was methodical.
Subtle.
He was methodical. That's the good way to put it. He was also slow. And he the paper had deadlines, and he had his own mind as to when the paper was done. He was a perfectionist. He did what he did, and so yeah, he had a corner of the place all to himself, and that's where the sports guys hung out. I mean, and I was one of the oddballs there. So my first job there was, I talked my way in. I got to do the sports thing. I kind of got the bug. A few months later, a job opened up in the newsroom side of things. And I have, my undergraduate degree was in government foreign affairs, and so the job of politics writer was open, a full-time job. So I was part-time sports guy, and worked my way into a full-time job. But I was also still just 23 years old, so I was able to talk the publisher into letting me be a full-time politics writer, but then still keep the stringer part of the job. So on weekends, I would cover high school games football games on Friday night. I would do the occasional basketball game during basketball season, UVA stuff whenever Jim, would need me to go cover UVA games. So, because what did I care? I was 23 years old, not making much money, but I was having a lot of fun. And it was, I got to straddle both of those worlds. But the sports department, man, if you just hung out in the sports department, it was a great world to be in. You saw those awards on the wall. He was the AP, the Associated Press Sports Editor of the Year. I don't know which year it was. I don't remember. I just remember staring at that award and thinking, man, that's this guy's big time, and yet he's still here. And he valued a small town life. He loved Waynesboro. He loved Waynesboro High School. If Waynesboro High School had a Domino's or a Yahtzee team, he'd be there covering. He'd be there with a notebook and a camera. He on his vacations, he would not, if he didn't leave town on vacation, he'd come in and take pictures at a game because he missed it that much when he was on vacation. Like, Jim, you're not supposed to be here. You're on vacation. Well, I just wanted to make sure we got photos. And so that rubbed off. I mean, it rubbed off on me. I know it rubbed off on you, Scott, and all the alumni out there. There's so many folks across the country that that worked with Jim, worked for Jim, and were influenced by his thinking. And it's an old school kind of thought, because now in the sports business, it's a hot take sports business, and Jim Gordon was the opposite of hot take. He just went to the game, covered the game. He boosted his local teams. He loved what he did, and that showed, every day, including those vacations when he'd come in and take photos. You couldn't get the guy away from the office. That's how much he loved what he did.
Oh, exactly. And you and I have a kind of a unique similarity in that our relationship with Jim, because he did have, and I like in your tribute you used the word Jim's guys, and boy, how fitting is that? Because let me tell you, I am honored to have been one of Jim's guys, but we're kind of unique because we both worked for the paper, and I had a similar situation. When Jim came to me, I had just started, I'd been there about a year and a half, and I was in display advertising, which is a heavy sales job. You know, I've been in the newspaper industry, you know how that is. Yeah. I was doing extremely well. When Jim asked me about coming there to do part-time writing, and I told him I didn't have that much writing experience. I knew sports. He said, I'll teach you that. And he did. He taught me a lot about that. But he came back to me about a day later, and he said, you're going to have to go and talk to the advertising manager, and I won't name his name, and the GM, and I won't name his name, because they want to talk to you about this. And so I did. I went into the GM's office, and the advertising manager was there. And, they put a lot of stock into their display advertising salespeople, because that's how the newspaper generates revenue. And I had a pretty good base of customers, pretty important base of customers, and I was doing a really good job. And they said, okay, you want to do this, and we know this is done at night, and we know a lot of times it's done late at night, and we know a lot of times your job in display advertising is also a lot of nights. And so here's the deal: we'll let you do it, but if your work starts, if your display advertising work, if your revenue slips, we're gonna pull the plug on that. And I said, okay, that's not a problem. I understand. I'll do my job. And if I have to, I'll give up. I'll give up sports. And they said, no, we're gonna pull the plug on your full-time job. That's how important we want you to take this. We want you to consider what you're about to do. And I never did flinch. I wanted to do it, and I did it for 7 years, both roles. And to be honest, now that I'm long cleared from that situation, I put in a lot more hours in the sports department than I ever put into the display advertising job. But Jim was, he was truly just a mentor to so many people, and the stories we could tell, we could be here and tell a month from now and still be telling stories about our experiences with Jim.
Yeah, I'll share. We talked about the alums, the Jim's guys, as I call them in the column. Patrick Height, who's the sports editor at the News Leader in Stanton. He's one of Jim's guys. Patrick and I worked a lot together with fellow stringers, just like you and I, Scott, as well. Jim Sacco, who's now the sports editor of the Daily News Record in Harrisonburg, was a sports editor for a long time down in Bristol at the Herald Courier. He's one of Jim's guys. Jim Sacco texted me last night. He read the columns, thanked me for writing the column, and he said that his fondest memory is the first year he worked at the News Virginian. Jim Gordon bought him a case of Guinness for Christmas as a Christmas gift, and that's Jim too. He was always giving us gifts. I told Jim that my gift that I remember the most from Jim was actually he gave me this really nice sports photography book. When I say really nice, one of these like $30, $40 books, huge picture book with all these great all-time sports photos. I still got it. It's down in my library, and and I remember the pictures. I looked at that book a lot of times. It was one of those kind of things where it was a gift, but also he knew his guys were out there taking photos. I was working for him. I needed to take some photos, so it made me actually want to take better photos. But that's on an honest newspaperman salary to go out there and buy gifts for his guys. That says a lot too. Josh Floyd's another one that comes to mind. Josh Floyd's now down, I think, at Everett College down in Southwest Virginia. He's in addition to working. This is the work ethic of all of Jim's guys. The last I remember, Josh and I follow each other on Twitter, so we do keep up with each other a little bit, but. He works his day job there at Everett. He was working in like the academic counseling side, but then at nights and on weekends he does play-by-play radio sports for their various sports teams. So there's guys all over the place, and that's just a few that had the influence, the work ethic, and the training. I mean, because we were all like you, Scott. Me too. Even though I could write, and I was going to go into a creative writing program, which incidentally. I never did go to that program. I fell in love with journalism and never left. But I had to still learn how to write journalism. And I wrote about that in my column about how I'd go to these games and I'd come back and I'd write a book about these games. And Jim would say, "He got 20 column inches, kid." I found out that meant around 600 words. And so, there was a lot of learning on my part too. And so Jim was constantly training waves of young guys coming in and how to do the business in addition to doing his own job. And that's, and now we're out here doing great things in other parts of the world. And that's an influence that kind of lives on too.
Yes, he gave me a book as well as for a Christmas present. It was a book written by Gary Kramer, whose father was the longtime play-by-play voice of the Virginia Cavaliers football, basketball. And Gary was a sports writer at the Daily Progress. And Gary wrote a book on UVA basketball, very hard book with lots of photos, all the way back from Buzzy Wilkinson up through the route there. And he gave a book to Jim and autographed it. And Jim must have purchased a book, and he personally autographed it to me. I know Jim probably purchased that book. He gave it to me. I'm sitting proudly in my bookcase right now. He is. Jim was a tremendously generous man. It is with his time too, not money per se, but I mean his time. He just dedicated his life to covering sports, and it wasn't all glamour, like you said. There was JV basketball, girls softball, all the way up to Final Fours. Jim and I went to Philadelphia and covered, I think it was the '82 Final Four that we got beaten in the semifinals to North Carolina. And then went back, then drove home that night, and probably on a Tuesday night was covering, something else, whatever sport was in early April. But that was Jim. That was the way Jim was. I've got two. Can I just take two real quick stories about Jim that are kind of opposite ends of the spectrum?
Yeah, go. I was going to say it's storytelling time, so let's go with it. Yeah.
So the first story was Jim had promised me a trip to the ACC basketball tournament. And tournament was, as it was back in the good old days, held in the Greensboro Coliseum every year. It was also back when the ACC was 8 teams. You'd have 4 games on Thursday, 2 on Friday, and the championship game Saturday night. So we were going to the Thursday games and then come back because Jim had stuff to do. UVA played the first game. I think they were the 8th seed that year. Played either Carolina or maybe Maryland. I'm not sure what. But, I mean, it was my first ever ACC tournament. I was just absolutely beside myself. I just could not believe I was going to get to cover an ACC tournament. And Jim's plans was we're going to meet at the News Virginia. We're going to leave at 7:30 a.m. Be there. Don't be late because, you know, I know the way down and it takes us long to get there. So I get there, you know, at 7 o'clock. Jim's already there. I'm thinking, oh, we're going to get on the road early. We might even have time to stop and get a biscuit or whatever. 7:30, Jim's still typing. He says the guys that worked the night before didn't do the bowling. They didn't put in the bowling. And Jim had to do that so it would get in the paper that day because at that time the News Virginian was still an active published paper. And he was typing and he would get a couple of phone calls. And so long story short, the 7:30 a.m. departure time was closer to about 9 a.m. And we had about a 3.5-hour drive to the Greensboro Coliseum for a 12 o'clock game. And, you know, I'm sweating bullets in his little tiny, I think he may have an MG or something at that time. And we're just plugging away. And we get there, we get close to the Coliseum. We're out on 29. It's like 10 minutes to 12. We got the pregame on the radio. I'm literally sweating bullets because I can just see my life pass in front of my eyes because I'm going to miss probably a good hunk of the portion of the first game, which was the Cavaliers against, I think it was the Tar Heels. And Jim kept assuring me, don't worry, I know a back way and I have a secret parking spot. And of course, I'm like, yeah, this back way is probably a one-way street. We're going to get stuck or whatever. Well, you know, we got close to the Coliseum. I could see the sign that said Greensboro Coliseum straight ahead. And Jim takes a left. And I'm like, Jim, it says straight ahead. Oh, no, but I know a back way. And again, long story short, he meandered through the back roads, the back alleys of the Greensboro Coliseum, pulls up into the shadows of the back entrance. And lo and behold, he pulls into a secret parking spot that no one was parked in. We get out of the car, and literally 15 yards ahead of us, we enter this back door. As we go through the door, I heard this horn sound for the start of the game. We get our press credentials right there at the table, which is where he said they would be, and literally we're sitting down as the referee throws the ball up for the tip-off. How we did that, how he knew that, I guess that's just Jim being Jim. And then the other end of the spectrum, I covered a big basketball game one Saturday. He asked me if it was a North Carolina Virginia game that I got the privilege of covering. It was a huge game. Ralph was against Michael Jordan. Came back. It was a Sunday paper. We did not have a Sunday paper, excuse me. So I came in on Sunday, wrote up a great story, long story. He told me I had plenty of space, wrote it up. And he also asked me if I'd call a high school coach to get a result of a basketball game that was played on Saturday night. And I did that, very graciously did that. And this was the day where you not only put the story in, but you had to type in the box score.
Yes.
If you can remember that. And so did that, was very glad to do that for Jim. Came in to work on Monday thinking that, you know, he was going to be praising me for this great story that I did. And he said, hey, I need to tell you something. And I'm thinking, oh boy, he's going to really praise me this. He said, you know that box score you put in, you forgot one player's name and his line, and he scored a point. And those are the kinds of things that Jim paid attention to.
Mm-hmm.
And, he didn't say a whole lot about the story of the North Carolina Virginia basketball game, but he did bring to my attention that I didn't pay close enough attention to detail of that one player that made one free throw that scored 1 point. That's the things that were important to Jim.
I haven't kept a play-by-play on a legal pad for years because we primarily cover college games, and there's live stats on the internet, and then they hand you a piece of paper with all that afterwards if you didn't already follow on the internet. But back when we were starting in the 90s, when I was starting in the 90s, you started in the 80s, you still need to keep your own stats, especially high school games. You would have to do that today in high school games, too, if you covered high school games. And so I just remember Jim showing me his system, which I never used. I couldn't figure it out. But he showed me a couple of his before I went to my first football game on a Friday night to cover. He showed me his little system for tracking. It looked like what you would see a college calculus professor on a blackboard. It was just all these little squiggles and numbers that you couldn't really make out and words you couldn't make out. But it meant something to him, and I say that to go into a story I shared in the column. So my first ACC tournament to cover, actually, I ended up going on my own. Jim came up to me a couple weeks before and said, "Hey, I got a deal for you. If you go cover the high school wrestling tournament down in Salem for me next weekend, I'll let you cover the ACC tournament." And I'm like, "All right, where do I sign?" Basically. Now, the paper wasn't, I was a stringer. I was a full-time writer for the news department, stringer for sports. So I had to make sure to have someone cover whatever news I needed covered if I was, going to be gone for 3 or 4 days. Also had to pay for my own hotel room because they weren't going to pay for my hotel room. It was, sort of an extraneous trip, I guess you'd call it. So had to figure that out. But, sign me up. I'll go cover the wrestling tournament for you. Which was actually a great experience. That high school wrestling tournament down in Salem, I've only done it that one time, but there was so much going on. The Salem Civic Center full of people, probably 10,000 people there. There's all these matches going on at one time. I thought I would dread it, but I loved it. So, and of course, there were a lot of wrestlers, local wrestlers to write about. It was a great experience. But then the ACC tournament. So, now, credentials, I have to apply for the credentials and do it every year, and we get them and all that kind of stuff. The process for credentials is now well known to me. But then I didn't know what. I just figured, hey, my boss is sending me there. That means I get to go, right? And so he the day I'm leaving, he grabs a business card, and I mean literally a business card, little business card, and he starts scribbling on the back of it his hieroglyphics, those same hieroglyphics that you would see in his football game summaries and that kind of thing when he would scribble his notes out at football games. So he's writing, and it looks like he's writing like he ran out of room, so he starts writing up instead of just across. And he hands me this and says, "Just give this to the lady at the desk, and this will get you in." And I look at the card, and there's nothing. There's not a single thing decipherable on this card, but it's got his name on the front. And so I drive down to Greensboro with this business card, and I show up at the Coliseum, and I sheepishly walk up to the media table. I feel like the biggest idiot in the world because all I've got is this business card, and it's got just scribble on the back of it. And I hand it to the lady, as he said. There'll be a lady at the table, hand it to her, and she'll let you in. Well, she doesn't let me in right away. She calls somebody else over, and they're laughing. And then somebody on a walkie-talkie comes over, and they're all, and I'm thinking to myself, man, they think I scribbled this note out. I'm sure they think I'm an imposter. They're going to put me in jail. And then Jim's going to fire me because I didn't get in and get to cover the tournament. And all it was I'm sure, and I wrote this in the column, I'm sure I wasn't the first person to hand over one of those little cards with scribble all over it with Jim Gordon's name on it. And they let me in, and I covered the tournament that year. But that's Jim. Again, that's Jim. And I'll say this real quick too, Scott, because I know you probably have another story to tell. But the first time he sent me to cover a UVA football game. Now, UVA football games now, the media parking lot is like a mile away from the stadium. They reserve those good spaces in the west parking lot for the high dollar people, which is great. That makes sense. It's business. But back in the day, back in the 90s, media still had parking right there in front of the stadium. And Jim hands me his parking pass, and it had the number 6 on it. And the number 6 was that close. I felt like I was parking inside the stadium with Jim Gordon's pass. That's longevity. That's having been there since the 60s. Jim carried some clout over there, is I guess what I'd say.
Absolutely, and respect, and a lot of it had to do with the people that were running the sports information department, the Rich Murrays, the Doyle Smiths. They knew Jim, and they knew that Jim was the ultimate professional. And I don't care if he was writing for the News Virginian or the New York Times. They knew that he was a pro and that he was there doing the job, and they showed him the respect that he certainly, deserved. One more quick story. I went down to a Clemson football game and with a friend, and we were not on press passes. We were just going down to Clemson UVA game, and I just on the day of the game, I got a call from Jim, and and this was in cell phone days, so this was in the early 90s, and he wanted to know if I could cover a basketball game or a football game. I think he was just planning his week ahead or something, and I said, sure, I can do it, whatever. And I made comment, I'm in South Carolina, I'm in Clemson. He said, well, you should have let me know when I got your press pass. He said, do you want a press pass? And I was like, well, yeah, I would. That would be great, but how are we going to do this? He said, well, just go and ask for, I think the guy's name was Zane. Go ask for Zane. And as it turned out, Zane was someone that had Jim had met or had worked with in college or something. And Zane was the assistant SID for the Clemson Tigers. And, he came out, I introduced myself. He said, oh, fine, come on, I'll get you a press pass. He even got a friend of mine that was not in the sports world. We had press front 50-yard line seats on press row in Death Valley to see UVA Clemson play. And that night, Virginia beat Clemson. I think it was the first time they'd ever beat Clemson in Clemson. And when we got ready to leave, he said, remind me to never, ever do Jim Gordon a favor again. So Jim had a clout, but Jim had clout, but he had no clue. He was completely irrelevant to any clout that he may have had.
Oh, totally, yeah. So I just remember another thing that pops to mind, because things are popping to mind. The last time Virginia won at Virginia Tech, 1998, 20 years ago, at the last minute, he asked me, hey, Chris, you want to tag along? Now, 1998, we're talking close to 4 years into my journalism career, and I'd written a column about the game going in. I used to write an annual column. He would let me write a column, and there was another reporter at the paper who was a Virginia Tech grad, and we would write dueling columns. We would jab at each other a bit and have some fun with the game. And so, day of the game, actually, he says, hey, you want to go to the game? And I'm like, well, heck yeah. So he shows up. Somehow he talks to some guy, and I'm sitting with his grandson, at the time 10-year-old grandson, and so I'm in the stadium with Jim, and for that last win in 1998, that's a long time ago, 20 years ago. I would say this too. You talked about the cloud or whatever, and it's extended. I mean, when I talk about how I wrote in the column that I owe my career to Jim Gordon giving me a job. It's even beyond that. I mean, yeah, I cut my teeth there, learned a lot there, but also you talk about Rich Murray, Scott, of course, and Rich's Waynesboro Times. Rich, on his way up the ladder in sports, and Rich was the longtime SID at UVA for sports, and still does some work actually with UVA on a contract basis. I've seen him at the NCAA baseball tournament the last couple of times UVA hosted. When I applied for credentials at the first time, which I think was back in 2005, Rich actually said, "Hey, I've known you since you worked for Jim Gordon. You're good." He even said, "I'm kind of going out on a limb here because you're internet only, and we haven't credentialed any internet onlys." That year, he credentialed us in the Sabre. but you're the first two, and I'm trusting you. But I know where you come from. I know that you worked with Jim Gordon, and so there you go. The other thing I'd say then is, there's only been one book on the history of University of Virginia basketball at University Hall. Patrick Height and I co-wrote that book. Patrick Height and I only know each other because we used to work together for Jim Gordon. So, for those folks listening who, got that book, read the book, loved the book, that's a legacy of Jim in a way. I mean, certainly because, again, Patrick and I didn't even know each other until we worked for Jim and we cut our teeth there together. And then the fact that, Scott, you and I get to do these games is an enduring legacy to Jim, just because, again, that's the way we got our foot in the door there was because of the work that we did for Jim back in the day.
Absolutely. You said Rich kind of went out on the limb and credentialing the Just the Free Press. And that would not have happened without your connections or your background with Jim. Yeah. Rich would have never done that. It might have happened eventually, but it wouldn't have happened in 2005.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, so Jim passed last week. He was 78 years old, Ohio University graduate, military veteran. I guess I'll say one more thing, and this is the sad part of the story, or the part that makes me mad, actually. We talked about how his last byline was probably more than a decade ago, and I'm pretty sure that last byline came actually in Augusta Free Press. I haven't searched the archives, but Jim wrote a couple columns for us around 10 years ago or so. And but I think it was 2002. I talked about how he's a guy whose career dates back to the paste-up era. It used to be, now of course things are laid out on computers and they're printed out. The paper itself, which is itself a dying institution, with all certainly the prevalence of online news, but the paper itself is laid out on computers and printed out a completely different way. Back in the old days, we wrote on computers, but then stories were actually printed and cut out and pasted on these big boards, and you had to use glue, and the headlines had to be cut out separately from the stories, and you had to, if you saw an ad, it kind of cut into the indentation of a story. I mean, that was all done by hand. That's the era that Jim, worked for 30 plus years in. The last couple years of his career were the era of the design on the computer, design all done on the computer. And he struggled. You would. If you worked for 30 years in one form, and then all of a sudden you're asked at the end, you have to adapt to this new form, you'd struggle. Well, the paper treated him being late with his pages, which he was late even in the paste-up days. He was such a perfectionist that he wanted it to be just right. But they treated his struggles learning the computer layout. They actually called it insubordination, which he's not being insubordinate. He's just slow. He's just learning. So there was a time actually that they brought me in. Now this was like 1999, I think it was. They brought me in and said, we're going to make you and Josh Floyd, the sports editors, because we're going to get rid of Jim. And so, they suspended Jim, and they suspended him a second time. And, it was one of those things. And I didn't want to learn layout. I still don't. I'm 20 years later. I know how to design websites, but I don't touch graphic design at all. My wife's a graphic designer, but I never touched it. So I told a story about how when Jim was on vacation, he'd show up and take pictures, and then you're like, Jim, you're on vacation. When he was suspended, he went out and covered games, and the first time he came back with a story, Jim, dude, they suspended you. What are you even? Well, I wanted to make sure the game got covered. That's how guileless he was in a very, very endearing way. But by 2002, he was out of the business, and not on his own volition. He had a lot still to offer. And, there's a lot of talk right now. I'll mention, Jerry Ratcliffe just let go by the Daily Progress, now apparently starting his own website. Back in 2002, now Augusta Free Press actually launched in 2002. So there were news websites coming up, but, we were way too far ahead of the curve. There was no option for a guy like Jim to just start a website. Like a guy like Jerry can do now. And so Jim, he's out. Jim was just let go. he caught on. He got a job. He was an usher at UVA basketball games for a long time. We would see him there all the time, Scott. In fact, sometimes you'd have to give him a ride back to his car, which was always fun because you got 10 minutes to hang out with Jim and get his thoughts on the game, that kind of thing, like the old days. But he was a business that he dedicated his life to. He was done wrong by at the end, and it's sad, and also still it just makes me mad that it ended that way for him all those many years ago.
Yeah, it is. That was sad, and I remember I wasn't working in the newspaper industry at the time, but I kept up with Jim a lot, and he still never had anything bad to say about the paper. He just went out gracefully, like Jim. That's what made Jim Jim. But yeah, he wasn't given the support. The paper was struggling, and right now they're probably as close to being on a ventilator as you could possibly be. And they were probably trying to cut salaries, even though he wasn't making a whole lot of money. It was probably as much money as anyone in the paper was making. So that was a convenient way. He couldn't keep up with technology, and he was a little behind where we are now with blogs and websites. So he was kind of caught out in no man's land, and he did. He landed on his feet. He went to UVA, and I remember talking to a longtime head of ushers there about Jim. And I actually suggested to Jim that he go and gave him the person's name. And I remember that gentleman, Monk Bingler, and Jim was that well respected. And when Jim went to ask him for a job, he not only said yes, but his response was, "Where do you want to work?" Basically leaving it up to Jim as to where his post would be. And Jim said, "Anywhere as long as I can see the game and close to the floor." They put Jim literally at a portal probably as close to the press row as you could get for a long time. And I know that made Jim happy.
So that's Jim Gordon, and we missed the guy already. And I too, Scott, regret that we were just talking about Jim on a recent trip we made together, and said we hadn't heard from Jim in a while. It'd be nice to catch up with Jim again sometime. And the last few years I'd run into him before he moved to Richmond with family in the past year. He lived at Summit Square, the old Waynesboro Hospital here in Waynesboro, and the Summit Square group would often send a group over to the Waynesboro Generals games back when I was involved with that team, and as general manager, as play-by-play announcer, and it's funny. There was one year we were always having sound issues with our internet radio broadcasts, and so one year I decided, well, what the heck, I'll just sit right behind home plate, get some crowd noise, it'll be kind of neat. And that year Jim came to a lot of games, and I wish, and they probably do exist somewhere, but I'm sure there are archives out there of that. I think it was a 2012 season that. So I'm on the air, and I was a solo broadcaster that year. I was play-by-play in color, doing 9 innings plus of baseball, 3 hours or whatever it would be, by myself. Of course, that means no bathroom breaks, etc. And I'm sitting right behind home plate. I set a table up. And in Kate Collins Field where the Generals play, you're like 30 feet behind the home plate when you're there, right behind that brick wall. It's really close. You can hear the glove, the ball hit the glove. You can almost feel the stitches, as the ball hits the glove. And there'd be Jim sitting right beside me. Now, he wasn't on the air, and he never wanted to go on the air. It was funny. I would ask him, "Hey, I can get you a headset here. You're going to be here anyway. We might as well talk." No, I'll let you do it. But then he would still talk the whole game. So, and
official color analyst.
And the interesting thing was you could hear him. I did go back and listen to a couple to see how it sounded. You could hear him faintly, but enough. You could tell what he was saying through my headphones, because through my microphone that was on my face there. So, so yeah, it was sort of like we were doing a game together, even though we really formally weren't. And, and he didn't think anything of it. He'd just tell me what he's thinking about the game. He'd sit there for 3 hours. It was a great time. And that was, I can't believe that was 2012, but it was 2012, and that's a long time ago now, 6 years ago. But yeah, missed the big lug, and again, I owe what I'm doing to the fact that he took a very raw green fiction writer and turned him into a sports writer, and so that's how I'll end. I'll give you a chance, Scott, to kind of give your last thoughts, but I'll just end by saying thanks, Jim, for everything.
Yeah, and one thing too, what you just said, and I learned, just because you love sports doesn't mean you can write sports. And even if you can write sports, writing it under deadline and writing it to fill up the appropriate amount of space, another completely different issue. And Jim taught you how to do that. Now, the last thing I'll add about Jim, two things real quick. One, last story, this was post sports editor days. I gave Jim a ride over, picked him up at Summit Square. He was waiting for me out front, gave him a ride to a UVA baseball game. We sat together, talked for the whole time, brought him home. He asked if I wanted to come in and see his little studio apartment. I did. No sooner got in the building, and one pretty old lady after another. Hi, Jim. Hi, Jim. Hello, Jim. Are you coming to dinner, Jim? And I was kidding Jim a little bit about it when we got into his studio, and I said, hey, I'm going to leave because I think you got a busy night ahead of you. You got all these women. And he said, it's not all like that. And he said, it's kind of good in one way, it's bad in the other. And I said, what do you mean? He said, yeah, I got all these women around me, but they don't know nothing about sports. And that's him. And then, the final thing I would want to say is if there were ever a Mount Rushmore of the News Virginian, if Jim Gordon's not on that, then I don't even want to take a look at that Mount Rushmore. Jim's got to be right up there.
Yes, indeed. Jim Gordon, I guess, now we'll really date ourselves and localize ourselves. Ed Berlin, the longtime editor. Trying to think. Well, I'm blanking on the name of the family that founded the paper. Not Massey, but Spillman. Louis Spillman and his wife Emily. They both started the paper back in the 20s.
Ed Berlin.
Yeah.
And maybe Jim Gordon. The reporters, none of them were there long enough to really make a lasting impression. None of the regular reporters.
Yeah, I was there 5 years. My wife was there because Jim hired me for a job. I had a job and then met my wife, and we've been married 18 years now. So good. That's also something good that came out, I guess, of the fact that Jim Gordon gave me a job. But I have to say that's very much a good thing. But yeah, most of us were there for a year, 2, 3 years, 5 years to most, and then moved on. And so that's the nature of the life at a small paper. But Jim was there for the duration. He was there until they kicked him out the door, and he didn't want to go then. So that says a lot about the guy too. Well, I guess that'll wrap us up. Sad podcast, but a happy one. I like to share the memories of Jim Gordon, and hopefully folks who listen all the way through got something out of this as well. Sign off the podcast as I normally do, especially here today with Jim Gordon. Wahoo wah.